Okay, so today we are, as you wanted to do, we are going to talk about insects. And I'm going to bring something up here. There it is. Okay, so we are going to talk about insects and us. And this is obviously a grasshopper. I think everybody knows that. So the question is, why should we care about the creepy crawlies? Why should we care about them? Should we think they're a good thing, a bad thing? Well, insects, and this is a close-up of the eyes on a dragonfly. Insects are bugged about the lies that people tell about them. People say insects are creepy. Whoops, where'd it go? Can you still see that? Can you still see the presentation? Yeah. Okay. So people say insects are creepy, and maybe that one is, since it's so big. They say that insects are pests, like the cockroach. They say that insects are destructive, like these. Some of you probably have these around your house in the summer. These are called carpenter bees, and they are called that because they do what this carpenter bee has done. They chew holes, these round holes in the wood on your house or your fences to make their nests. So that's destructive. They say insects are icky, like worms. A lot of people like to fish, but they don't like to bait the hooks because they don't like to touch the worms. They say that insects, like especially ants, get all over the food and they ruin your picnics and campouts. And they say that insects are just of no benefit, like the mosquito here. This is a close-up of a mosquito getting ready to bite somebody on the skin. Well, the cockroaches say, no way, Jose. And that's right, because believe it or not, we do need insects. Why do we need insects? Well, we're going to go through why we need insects. And that picture right there is what's called a damselfly, and they're related to dragonflies, and you see those a lot around water. You see them around lakes and streams. Well, first of all, insects provide food for other creatures. They provide food for birds and bats and something called amphibians. That's a vocabulary word for this week, and fish. And those creatures are in turn eaten by predators. Now, amphibians are creatures like salamanders and newts, and an amphibian really is a creature who, as a baby and as like a child like you, lives in the water, and it breathes through gills like a fish. But then when it turns into an adult, it grows legs and it comes up on land and lives on the land and breathes through a nose and lungs, just like we do. So they change, they transform when they get old. So in that way, insects are what is considered the bottom of the food chain, which is another vocabulary word. Does anybody happen to know what a food chain is? I couldn't hear. I heard somebody say something. A food chain is, how do I describe this? A food chain is a series of events where a little tiny animal is eaten by a bigger one, and that one's eaten by a bigger one, and that one's eaten by a bigger one, and so on. So, for example, fish eat little tiny fish and crawdads, and then those fish are eaten by us. And that's a very short but good example of a food chain. Now here's another one. If you look at the bottom left, that green stuff, that's algae in the water, which is just like a living, floating plant, sort of. And it's eaten by insects, which you see above it. And then the insects are eaten by the crawdads. The crawdads are eaten by, you see the 4 fish here, those are crappies. Then the crappies are eaten by this bigger fish, which is a largemouth bass. And down below him, the largemouth bass that you see with the fish in his mouth is eaten by a river otter. Then the river otter is eaten by a coyote. That guy in the middle is snarling there. And eventually then the coyote dies. And after the coyote dies and his body decomposes, all the minerals and so on that were in his body wash into the streams, wash into the lakes, and that's eaten by the algae. So it's just a continuous circle around and around and around where smaller creatures or things are being eaten by larger ones. And it happens everywhere in life. So the insects are the very bottom of this thing in most cases. So insects actually serve, besides that, 4 different purposes. First of all, they are what are called decomposers. They eat dung, which dung is another vocabulary word. Does anybody know what dung is? I couldn't hear. Dung is just another word for scat or poop. So some insects eat that. They eat dead plants and animals. And when they do that, they unlock nutrients for the soil and living plants. What nutrients are little tiny minerals that are needed for different things to survive. So when it comes to these things that these insects eat, the dung, the dead plants and animals, there are things like nitrogen and iron and calcium. I'm sure you've all heard of these things, and those things go into the soil because as these animals, these creatures do that, they leave crumbs, just like you do when you eat, and the crumbs soak into the soil. The other thing they do, some of them, is they eat other insects that are disease carrying parasites, which is another vocabulary word. And what a parasite is a creature that feeds off of other creatures, but doesn't do any good for the other creatures. For example, mosquitoes. Everybody, I think, knows why mosquitoes bite us, right? Mosquitoes bite us because they want to suck blood out of us, because that's what they eat. And they do that, but they don't give us any benefit. Oh, and sometimes they can make us sick, but the only thing they do is give us that itchy lump. So they don't do anything for us. They just take from us. Now, some insects are pest controllers. There are insects that are called predatory, and that means that they feed on other creatures. They are predators, just like hawks are predators because they feed on small mammals. And snakes are predators because they feed on large insects and toads and frogs and little birds. So these predator insects, they eat other insects that destroy crops, farmers' crops. And that saves the farmers billions of dollars every year. And as long as that happens, they have less of a need to use pesticides. And pesticides is another vocabulary word. Pesticides are chemicals that farmers spray on their crops, or we spray on our gardens to kill insects that harm the plants or harm the crops, the fruit, the vegetables. So another thing that some insects do is they are pollinators. And I'm sure you probably heard of this. Everybody recognizes what this insect is, right?
Yes.
What is it? Can somebody tell me what it is?
Bee.
That's right, it's a honeybee. And honeybees are pollinators. And a pollinator is a creature that takes pollen away from flowers and other types of plants that have flowers, like some vegetables like carrots have flowers. And it deposits that pollen onto the flowers of other plants. And the reason that's important is the way that plants make new plants, kind of like them making their babies, is that they have to get pollen from another plant. So although the bees and other pollinators don't do that on purpose, they do it accidentally, but they do it, and that's very important to us. And the reason is, like this says, think about this. Think about how often you eat, and in just one meal, how many bites of food you take. Well, 1 out of every 3 bites of our food has relied on creatures like honeybees pollinating plants. So that's very important to us. And then the final thing is some insects are soil workers. Insects like termites, ants, earthworms, and other insects that burrow and nest underground do something called aerating the soil. And what aerate means, and this is another vocabulary word, is that as they burrow and nest, they leave tunnel or spaces that air and water can get into in the soil. And that's extremely important. Very, very important. And here's why. Dirt or soil, this circle, this is called a pie chart. And this shows you what dirt is made up of. Now, if you see that bright blue, that little percent or part right there is what's called organic matter, like dead leaves, minerals from dead plants and animals. The orange, which is a larger part, is minerals that come from rock, like iron and lime, sand, calcium, and so on. But now that light blue, which is the biggest chunk, which is half of it, that's air and water space. Would you ever think that half the dirt is air and water space? That's how it is. So it's important that those soil workers do what they do. And the reason for that is every plant and every tree, they need to get air and water to their roots because that's how they live and that's how they grow. So hopefully you're starting to see there are a lot of good things that insects do for us. So now we're going to play a little game, kind of like we did last week. I'm going to show you pictures of some insects, and you're going to have to guess, are they a decomposer? Are they a pollinator? Are they a pest controller? Or are they a soil worker? And the pictures you see here on the left, that's a dragonfly. You probably know that. In the middle, that's what's called a stag beetle. And stag beetles collect and eat dung. And they are a decomposer since they do that. That's why they have those very, very large jaws to carry pieces of poop to their nest. And then on the right is a millipede, which they live in the soil. Okay, everybody ready? First one. This is a wolf spider. A wolf spider. What do you think a wolf spider is? What do they do? Does anybody have a guess?
They eat other bugs.
That's right. The wolf spider is a pest controller. They eat what we consider bad insects, like mosquitoes and flies and roaches and ants and mites that get into our houses and cause us problems. A lot of people kill every spider they see in their house, but if you actually really killed them all, you would all of a sudden start to see lots and lots of roaches and ants and mites. And in the summertime, flies and mosquitoes in your houses because there wouldn't be any insects hunting them like the wolf spider does. And, you know, I will mention too, a lot of people think if you see roaches in your house, it's because your house is not clean. And that's not really true. because there are types of roaches besides cockroaches that get into your house for other reasons. A lot of times what people see and think is a cockroach is really something called a wood roach. And they are in your house because they like to chew on and eat wood. Now, the next one, the carpenter bee. We already talked about it. What do we think a carpenter bee is? Anybody have a guess on the carpenter bee?
What?
What's that?
What?
Well, the carpenter bee actually is a pollinator. Even though they do this thing of eating the wood on our houses and chewing holes in our wooden fences, they are a pollinator the same as any other bee. Because they don't eat the wood, they chew. They chew up that wood just to make their nest, to make their holes. They actually eat pollen, and as they get it from off of flowers and plants, they accidentally spread it to other ones on flowers and vegetables and fruits. So next, the housefly. Everybody knows these. Everybody gets annoyed by these. What do you think the housefly is? Because it does serve a purpose. Anybody want to take a guess what a housefly is? No? Okay, well, I'll tell you. A housefly is a decomposer. Houseflies eat dead materials. They eat dung, and they eat off of dead leaves, off of dead plants, dead animals. And again, just like you do when you eat a meal, you leave crumbs, you leave bits and pieces. Well, flies do that too. And those bits and pieces go into the ground and they add nutrition to the ground. They put things into the ground that plants need to survive on, and also that the burrowing insects that live in the dirt need to survive on. So the earthworm, what do you think those are? And this has nothing to do with them being used as bait for fishing. What do you think earthworms do? What are they? Yes, exactly. Earthworms are soil workers. They make tunnels for air and water to fill as they burrow in the soil. And again, that air and water is needed by plant roots. So I think we have one more here. Yes, the praying mantis. I'm sure everybody has probably seen these in the late summer at one point or another. Anybody want to take a guess? This one's probably pretty easy about what a praying mantis is.
It eats other bugs.
Right. And before we talk about that, I want to explain one thing about the praying mantis. If you notice how this one here is all totally green, except for the ends of its front legs, that is a praying mantis that is native to our country. They've always been here, and that's called the Carolina mantis. But now if you see a praying mantis that is green like this, but its wings and its back are brown, that's called a Chinese mantis. And they actually did come here from China. They were brought here on boats accidentally. And the problem with that is Chinese mantises are much stronger hunters than the Carolina mantis. They have much bigger appetites, so they eat an awful lot of food that the Carolina mantises need. So that's a problem. So the praying mantis, yes, it's a pest controller. And here you see this one's captured a grasshopper. They eat mostly harmful insects like Japanese beetles and ladybugs, because those types of insects destroy plants. And what insects like Japanese beetles do when they're on plants is they chew the bottoms of the stems. So the plant's leaves fall off, and if they don't have leaves, they can't collect sunlight to turn into energy, and they die. So unfortunately, I have to tell you that around the world, most insects are disappearing very quickly. We talked in the mammal class about animals going extinct. Well, a lot of insects are going extinct. And again, keep in mind, they are at the bottom of the food chain. They're eaten by a lot of other animals, which benefit us. And this is just some pictures of some animals. From left to right, we have dragonflies and damselflies. Next to that, butterflies and moths. Then in the middle, bees, wasps, and ants. They're all grouped together. Next to that, beetles. And then on the right, grasshoppers and crickets. And if you look at these pie charts at the bottom, the blue is out of all of them over the last 30 years, the blue represents how many of them are gone now. And the yellow is how many remains. So it doesn't look too bad on dragonflies and damselflies, but when you look over at beetles and grasshoppers and crickets, most of them have disappeared, more than half. Now you might have noticed last summer and the summer before, there weren't anywhere near as many lightning bugs at night as what we usually have. And this is why they're going extinct. They fall into that category of the beetles where more than half of them are gone already. And that's very sad. And it's something that, again, is very important to us. So you might wonder, what can we do about it? Well, here's a few things. You can ask your parents to only use natural pesticides or herbicides in your yard and gardens, not chemicals. Pesticides, which again are sprays to kill bugs that are harmful, and herbicides are sprays that are used to kill weeds. Now, even though those things are meant for those things, when they are made from chemicals, they kill anything that comes in contact with them. And that's not a good thing. But there are pesticides and herbicides for sale that are made from natural ingredients that only kill what they're meant to kill. So you can ask your parents to look into that and use those things. Another thing you can do, and this is kind of hard at times, is leave insects alone. Avoid killing them because most of them are beneficial to us. You shouldn't just say, ooh, there's a bee sting, and kill it, because you're killing something that gives a lot of benefit to us. And if you get a bee's nest or a hornet's nest in your yard, your parents shouldn't try and remove that themselves. For one thing, they could really get stung an awful lot. They should have it removed by a professional, somebody that does that for a living, because what they do is they will move that nest to someplace better so that the bees can continue to make their honey. Sometimes they put them on bee farms, which there is such a thing, believe it or not. And they'll move the hornet's nest because even though hornets are very bad stingers, they are also pollinators, believe it or not. And another thing is you can ask your parents, and you can do this with them, to plant native plants in your garden areas. It's really nice to have roses and peonies and other pretty flowers in your gardens, but there are a lot of plants that have nice flowers that were here for thousands of years, and you can plant those, and the insects prefer those. One big thing is, a lot of people have been worried because of the monarch butterflies. Does everybody know what a monarch butterfly looks like? Okay, good. That's if you don't, that's the ones with the black and orange wings. The monarch butterflies are going extinct. And part of it is them having trouble finding food. And one thing that they really, really like is called cone flowers. There are orange cone flowers and purple cone flowers, and they really like to eat the pollen on those. And another thing, believe it or not, is something called milkweed. And it's really not a weed. It's just a plant that most people don't like to have around. But the monarch butterflies and pretty much any kind of caterpillar really, really like the pollen on milkweed, and milkweed produces a lot of pollen. So that attracts those insects and is a place for them to feed. And then the last thing you can do, because a lot of people are concerned about those carpenter bees making those holes, and there are other types of bees that do that also, is you can make with your parents, or they can buy something called bee hotels for what is termed solitary bees. And that word solitary means they live alone. They only get together to have babies, and other than that, they live by themselves. And here's what some of them look like. They are just boxes, a lot of them, that have these holes in them that are not quite an inch around. The picture on the right is one that somebody made out of a piece of tree limb. And the bees, if you put that near your house, those bees will use those holes in those houses to make their nests instead of chewing on your houses and fences. And it doesn't have to be real fancy like this. Here's one that I made that I have on my fence. And it's just a kind of a long chunk of wood that I put those holes in and hung it on my fence. And if you look over there on the left, you can see one hole that's plugged up. That's because a bee stayed in there for the winter, and he's got the hole plugged up to keep the cold air out. So I want to end this showing you that besides being beneficial, a lot of insects, and sometimes it's the teeniest ones, are the most beautiful things that you would ever want to see. And if you take a magnifying glass and just go out and look on the undersides of plants in your yard in the summer, you'll see some of these. And they're really beautiful to look at. So these are what are called tree hoppers. They're really, really, really tiny, and you do need a magnifying glass to see these very well, because they're, if you've ever seen a pen like your mother would use in sewing, they're only about the size of the head of the pen, the round part of the pen. They're very tiny. But as you can see, you know, the one on the left has very beautiful colors, and both of them have very, very interesting patterns to the colors. And now the one on the right with all the different shades of browns and yellows, that is to camouflage them, make them blend in with tree limbs and tree bark and twigs, so that it's harder for birds to find them, because birds like to eat them, and so do other insects that are larger. And now here are some different varieties of praying mantis. And I just showed this because it's interesting. The one on the left is the ones that are native to here, the Carolina praying mantis. And that one's that very, very bright bluish green color because it's young. They start out that color and they get the darker green as they get older. And then the one in the middle there, that is a different Chinese version of the praying mantis, that with all the pinks and reds. And then on the one on the far right with those long curly antennas that almost look like goat horns, and what looks like wings sticking out on its back there, that is a type that is in Europe. So again, those are all very pretty. Now here are caterpillars. I think a lot of people like caterpillars. And here are four of the most beautiful, interesting caterpillars. That one on the top in the middle, the orange one, kind of looks like a puppy, doesn't it? With little short ears. That's what happens in nature. It's disguised to look like something other than what it is, so that it doesn't get eaten by a bird. And the one on the right, that's what a monarch butterfly caterpillar looks like. And then that one on the left with all the pinks and reds and oranges doesn't even look like a caterpillar, does it? Doesn't even look like one. And that's the idea. It is born to not look like a caterpillar. So if it doesn't look like a caterpillar, and a bigger insect like a praying mantis sees it or a bird sees it, it's not going to think, hey, that's something to eat. It's not going to know what it is, but it's at least not going to think it's something to eat. And that's the idea. Now, this creature is called the Io moth. And if you ever saw one of these, you would probably see it around a street light or around a campfire at night. And you would know it because they are very large. They are as big as your mommy or your daddy's hand. When their wings are open, they are that big, and some are even a little bigger than that. And they are from South America. They come here during the summer, and then when it gets cold here in the fall, they go back to South America. And there are different types of them. That's why you see the different colors on these. They have on their bodies and some of them on their wings that thick fuzz that you see. And that's really not wing material. It really is a kind of a fuzz, a kind of a fur. And then on the picture on the bottom left, the green thing with what looks like it's got a bunch of sprouts or cactuses on it, that's actually what its caterpillar looks like. And it's doing two different things. Like the moth we saw, or the caterpillar we saw in the previous picture, it doesn't even look like a caterpillar. So other creatures don't see it as something to eat. And it's that green, so it blends in with leaves. That's camouflage. And here's just a few different things. On the left, this is called a wasp moth. It really is a moth, but it is shaped and looks like a wasp. And that's part of what it does to keep predators away. You know how fierce wasps are. They come at you and they come at you and they try to sting you, and their sting hurts a whole lot. And other creatures know how that is. If another insect, even a bigger insect, gets stung by a wasp, it dies. So other insects are afraid of wasps. So this moth, to protect itself, looks like a wasp. Now in the center, I think this is just a really, really pretty picture. This is a member of the dragonfly family, and it is called a red-veined darter. And it is called that because the way it flies, it zips around, changing directions very quickly. And it looks the way it does in this picture because this was taken in the early morning. And you know how you get dewdrops on the grass in the summer? Well, it happens to be covered with dewdrops. This is the early morning. The sun hasn't burned that moisture off of its body yet. And it's called a red-veined darter because of those red colors you see on the tops of the eyes. That bright blue is the eye with the red on the top. And then, although we don't have these here, they are pretty, they're pretty spread out on the eastern United States. This creature on the right is called an eastern lubber. And the eastern lubber is a type of grasshopper. And it's really interesting because it has those Halloween colors, all of that orange and black like we see in Halloween decorations. But it is a type of grasshopper. And grasshoppers actually are beneficial to us. A lot of people give grasshoppers a bad name because they say they eat and destroy plants, but they really don't. They eat and destroy insects that are harmful, like mites and red ants, which when red ants bite you, it burns. It eats those. It eats termites, which chew up the wood on our houses. So hopefully you can see insects are not necessarily a bad thing. They do a lot for us and a lot for the world. They provide a lot of different things for us. They are of a lot of benefit, especially to people. And we really do need them because again, they're the bottom of the food chain. And if we didn't have them, there are a lot of things we would lose. Imagine just the pollinators alone. If all the pollinators died off, the plants wouldn't get pollinated and they would all die off. So imagine one day all the insects are gone, and because all the insects are gone, we don't have plants anymore. We don't have fruits and vegetables anymore. And then the next thing that happens is we don't have cows and chickens and lambs anymore because they eat foods that are vegetable based. They eat wheat, they eat corn, they eat barley and alfalfa, and all those things get pollinated by insects and by the wind. And we would lose all the fish too, because the fish eat insects, the smaller ones, and they're eaten by the larger ones. So if we lost the insects, you know, with by the time you kids have grandkids, those grandkids, once you're gone, could run out of food. And that's a very, very sad way to look at things. So that's why these insects are important to us. So now, does anybody have any questions about any of the things we've covered or any of the vocabulary words? No? Okay, I want to ask kids, did you like this program?
Yeah.
Okay, good. It was good information for you? Good, good. I'm glad to hear that. So like I said, next week and from then on, I will be there in person to do the programs. And we are going to have some good activities with every one of them. That's something actually that I have been working on, is activities for programs. So we're going to have some fun things for you to do that are related to our classes. Does that sound good? Okay, good. What was I? Okay, so what kind of program would you like to have me do for next week? What subject would you like to talk about? I'm going to stop this presentation. Let me pull up, I've got a whole list of programs that we can do, and I'll read some of these things off to you to see if they're of any interest to you. Let's see. Here it is. Okay, so here's some of the things we could do. We could talk about soil and bedrock and something called aquifers. And aquifers are giant lakes and rivers that are deep underground. We could talk about trees. We could talk about aquatic insects, and that means insects that live in the water, and they're so tiny you can't even see them, but there's lots of different types. We could talk about amphibians and reptiles, which reptiles are creatures like snakes and turtles and toads and frogs. We could talk about the geology of Ohio, meaning everything about Ohio and our area that has to do with rocks and what you see as far as rocks and cliffs and waterfalls go around our area. We could talk about bats. We could talk about birds. We could do a separate program on owls, which is very good because owls are the most amazing and most unique of birds and maybe of all animals together. We could talk about wetland areas, bird migrations. We could talk about something called a watershed, which has to do with our system of streams and rivers and lakes and why they are the way they are and what they do. We could talk about bees and dragonflies. We could talk about what plants do and how plants work, because believe it or not, although plants don't have brains, they do a lot of the things that we do. They are able to smell, believe it or not. Plants are able to see certain things. They're even able to hear certain things. And now we could talk about the glaciers that were here millions of years ago, because they help shape the way Ohio looks and what is here as far as plants and animals. And glaciers, I think we talked about a couple times, were the huge sheets of ice that covered the state. And then we could take a look at our prairie areas, and we could talk about forests. So those are all things that I have done before that we have not covered yet. And then I think, the last one is we could talk about ecosystems, something called an ecosystem, which is, it's sort of related to the food chains, but covers a lot more different things. So any ideas what you would like to cover? What you would like to talk about? What's that?
Vote for owls. Raptors, yeah.
It was a little too loud. I couldn't make out what everybody was saying.
I think they're talking about doing owls.
Owls? Oh, you're gonna like that one. Believe me, you're really gonna like it. It's gonna be very interesting for you. I will be very happy to do one on owls because that is something that I am very excited to talk about. So that's what we'll do next week, owls, and I will be there in person to do that. And Karen, did you see my email last night?
I did. I was going to forward the handouts to the parents because I didn't have time to print them this morning.
Oh, okay.
But I did see that you were willing to do it in person. I was going to email you back and even offer if you wanted to do it every other. So I know you're driving from the west side, but I can email and we can talk about options. Unless if you want to do it every week, that's fine. But if you want to do it every other, that would be fine too.
If it would be better for the kids every week, I will do it every week because that's what it's about. What's going to be best for them and what they'll get the most benefit from. You know, that's why I asked to begin with. I want to be of as much benefit, you know, to them as I can be. And then, you know, let me know about